Chapter 1 of Democracy and Difference Through Aesthetics of Film. Institutionalized rejection of difference is an absolute necessity in a profit economy which needs outsiders as surplus people. We have no pattern of relating across our human differences as equals. As a result, those differences have been misnamed and misused in the service of separation and confusion. As we, middle North Americans, settle into the new millennium, it becomes more and more apparent that our sense of ourselves and the groups we identify with often stand in stark contrast to one another. This social heterogeneity within our national borders complicates and challenges a traditional socialization and understanding of what it means to be an American in a cultural sense. With this in mind, it does not seem far-fetched to suggest that present understandings of difference may prevent us from arriving at a differently shared collective location, a unifying uncommon place from which we might do our particular, not yet named brand of democratic politics, U.S. democratic politics. I am not suggesting that an all-encompassing collective location or universal unifying commonplace currently exists or is yet imaginable. It is difficult to imagine such a place within the confines of our present social and cultural environment. While I do not believe that an all-encompassing collective location or universal unifying commonplace currently exists or is yet imaginable, I am committed to the exploration into its possibilities. In other words, I am intrigued by the thought that one might be able to transcend difference while at the same time respecting and honoring it, and uncover some shared experiences that may affect one's sensibilities. I am not suggesting that variations, simple differences in hair, eye color, accent, or dialect, or likes or dislikes of art, music, are prohibitors of democratic politics, although art and music can be quite telling and intriguing. Rather, it appears that in our search for identity, whether that search be an individual or collective one, we as diverse people continually involve in differentiating ourselves from one another on deep levels. Thus, emphasis should be on deep differences in our culture and social identities. Specifically, our cultural constructed identities stemming from sexual orientation, racial classifications, and gender assignments or constructions. Those are the three big, deep differences that the author believes that we cannot ever find unifying ground because of. These differences inform and enable us to see the world in specific ways, in ways that are far more complicated than those that arise in a culturally homogeneous community or society. In other words, I am interested in probing further and deeper into the understanding of strong cultural or social difference than the traditional liberal conception of this complex concept, and its particular focus on differences of opinion that are mediated through procedural or electoral politics. I want to align myself with theorists who call for a reintroduction of the body, a culturally produced body, back into our politics and our understanding of ourselves. For example, Jean Cohen, Democracy, Difference, and the Right of Privacy in 1996 writes, "By this I mean that our bodies, our symbolic interpretation of our bodies, our imaginary identification of our bodies and selves, and our sense of control over our bodies are central to the most basic sense of self, to our identity and our personal dignity." Cohen, 1996, page 205. By directing the attention to difference away from the traditional liberalism and its focus on a procedural framework that erases the face of an individual with a strong social identity, leaving only the mark of citizen as an individual who bargains, and toward a body politics, our sexualities, our color, our genders, our experiences. I hope to begin a process of imagining the possibilities, then explore those possibilities for a unifying, uncommon location that allows for a just democratic politics, that is, a politics that recognizes, respects difference, and aims at connecting one kind of experience with another while ensuring the rights and welfare of all society's members. There is an inherent power in imagination by setting aside that which we often consider to be real. Perhaps experiences that are thought to be personally exclusive in some neat cataloged within the realm of conventionally considered to be rational, and allowing our sensibilities to be transformed in ways that aid in our feeling freer to imagine ourselves and others in uncommon ways, where quite distinct moments in our memories and our imaginations connect with those distinct moments in others' memories and imaginations. We position ourselves and our discussions and conversations regarding deep differences in our cultural and social values on a level other than that which has been established by traditional liberalism. At this alternative level of understanding difference, it becomes necessary to alter conventional meanings of particular terms in order to open up and transform our sensibilities in ways in which we see ourselves and others. Let me read that again. We want to change the definition of words so we can win our arguments. Okay. We position ourselves and our discussions and conversations regarding deep differences in our culture and social values on a level other than that which has been established by traditional liberalism. At this alternative level of understanding difference, it becomes necessary to alter conventional meanings of particular terms in order to open up and transform our sensibilities in ways in which we see ourselves and others. In relation to this aspect of deep difference, I will also note the problematic and enormous effects violence has on the makeup of our social and cultural identities. For those of us confronting and the questions surrounding identity and the ability to envision democratic politics in a way that both respects and transcends difference lines, violence in its many forms deserves our attention as well because of the way it affects identity across difference lines. Gay bashing, lynching, police violence, black on black and other violent crimes, domestic violence, and the assimilation process. Here again, I am suggesting a focus that goes deeper than the conventional understanding of violence, of a contemporary term violence, one that gives greater attention to non-conventional forms. I mean, to suggest that assimilation, poverty, and alienation, among other acts, can invade oneself and cause direct harm. And although this harm cannot be characterized as direct physical violence in conventional sense, it is by all means bodily harm in a matter it affects a person. I do not concur with those that claim violence does not exist unless there is a physical act of beating someone over the head, actual physical harm. Chantal Mouffe, in Democracy, Power, and Political, 1996, describes this non-conventional threat of violence to democracy when considering the notion of universal rational consensus and the violence involved in those aims. She writes, "Indeed, this, a universal rational consensus, can lead to violence being unrecognized and hidden behind the appeals to rationality, is often the case in liberal thinking, which disguises the necessary frontiers and forms of exclusion behind pretenses of neutrality." 1996, page 248. Thus, many people living within what I have identified as difference circles, which are non-linear geometric groups. People like to be categorized in groups, and when you're not in those groups, regardless to race, sexual orientation, and what was the third one? Some sort of identifying characteristic, unless you're in those little groups. These non-linear geometric groupings of people who sit on the margins of a dominant we society identify as such as other people who may reason differently than those living within a dominant we society have experienced a direct violence that pervades their identity and their lives. This should be addressed. The different circles can be seen below in figure 1.1. Can I get an angle here for these circles? You can't see it. They're there. They like to categorize us in groups based on deep differences, which can only be defined as race, skin color, sexual orientation, and self-imposed characteristics of identifying self. So beyond those, we can't have any unifying factor, according to this person. Non-linear geometric groupings of people who sit on the margins, blah, blah, blah. Does a just democracy rest exclusively within the homogenizing of model of identity, where not only the citizens' culturally produced bodies are homogeneous, but where their value are also neutral? The same. Is it possible that the idea of universal democratic U.S. citizenship accommodates difference? Can we hope for a democracy that moves beyond exclusive attention to rights and procedure and recognizes, move beyond the attention to rights? Your rights need to be superseded, as well as respects difference in substantive terms through recognition. In other words, can we improve upon our democracy by incorporating alternative and unconventional ways of looking at and recognizing difference? So the more we can recognize difference, the better our democracy will be. Democratic rights and procedures are worthwhile, yes, and necessary to democracy. However, directing the study of difference into additional spaces will only complement conventional arguments and thus strengthen U.S. democracy. While the divide of difference is not new to the United States, cultural diversity has been paramount to the American myth and the topic of liberal scholarly investigation for some time. It appears to be more pronounced at the far edges of modernity as people on the margins of dominant culture claim their voices and those not on the margins resist those efforts at recovery. The American myth. Is there a place where we, as transformed citizens, residents of the United States, can envision and celebrate difference, sexual orientation, racial classifications, and gender assignments, the deep differences? Can we come together without demanding or coercing assimilation and envision a location where we can conduct or perhaps redefine or reimagine a just democratic politics? Again, can we prevent a politics of separation, conflict, violence, and opposition by creating or imagining some uncommon grounds from which to freely express our diverse and social and cultural identities, our sexuality, our various experiences as persons of color, and our genders without the threat of violence, where we can connect to some kind of human experience with another? So you need to be a person of color to be a racial classification that's been discriminated against. What about Irish? They're not people of color, and yet Ireland was probably colonized harder than any place in the 1800s and prior, specifically because of its location and proximity to its colonizers. But no, you have to be a person of color and our gender without the threat of violence, where we can connect when one kind of human experience with another. Is this possible, or is there simply no answer to this question, leaving separatism? So we must be separate into our geometric circles, separate. We can't come together because race issues. I want to examine how the literature on difference informs those questions so that I might identify gaps in the research and thus push forward with a search for a richer sense of identity and difference, and how politics might be affected. For example, one sensibility might be affected and transformed. Identity and difference, a selected review of the literature. Satya Mohanty, in The Epistemic Status of Cultural Identity in 1993, suggests that finding a place where we as citizens and residents can transform difference might be possible. However, this search for an uncommon ground involves serious work directed at identifying genuine cultural differences and similarities across groups and recognizing of sorts, as well as re-examination of the relationship between personal experiences and public meaning. What is most interesting in Mohanty's work is her construction of a realist theory of social or cultural identity. Specifically, the theories focus on experience as raw material. We're a blank slate, and their experiences are the raw material in which we build our identity. Okay. For the construction of identities. She defines identities as theoretical constructions that enable us to read the world in specific ways, for it is them and through them that we learn to define and reshape our values and our commitments, that we give texture and form to our collective features. Page 55. Mohanty's questioning of identity involves re-examination of the relationship between personal experience and public meaning. She argues that relationship between experience and identity is a genuine philosophical and theoretical issue to be addressed, and that experience, the variety of ways in which humans process information, is the raw material in the creation of self-identity. Our experiences, according to Mohanty, are not ours alone. Rather, our experiences are shared with others. And in order to recover ourselves, we must uncover our shared experiences. Her assertions are important to any search for democratic politics aimed at recognition and respect of difference, that in a realist theory of identity informs any work that connection one kind of human experience or another. So Mohanty is saying that these raw material, that our experiences are not how we remember those experiences on a personal, individual level, but they should also be viewed as a collective experience. I guess being an individual interpretation of that is just too selfish. It needs to be collective and agreed upon by the collective, okayed by the collective. Interesting. There is a collective consciousness, though, in that kind of way. The collective characteristic, collective definitions of words that are different than the individual. They're wrong, but they're different. This notion of social or cultural identity suggests that ownership of ourselves is not purely an individual affair. Rather, there is a differently shared collective identity that materializes after we gain access to the buried memories and experiences of those who might have shared our lives and experiences. Alasdair MacIntyre, in After Virtue in 1984, would concur by examining how we are merely co-authors of our own narratives, by suggesting that we are storytellers. MacIntyre claims our co-authored stories aspire to truth. Thus, Mohanty's theory seems to be well placed and appropriate when discussing within the confines of different circles, as illustrated in her focus on Toni Morrison's literature text, Beloved, in 1988. What I don't understand is they're saying that there's these deep differences, and we need to understand these deep differences because of the experiences that these people of color, sexual orientation, gays, and self-constructed identities can't be our own. They need to be agreed on by the collective. So how can they have their own individual based on their racial or sexual orientation, have theirs, but not take into effect the co-authoring of those experiences by the mainstream? Okay, I read on. Beloved, 1988. What she does not address directly, however, is whether the realist theory of identity and its reliance on access to buried memories and experiences aids us in moving beyond homogeneous difference circles into the intersections between various different circles, geometrically separated circles, like gays, people of color, whatever the other one was. You need to be categorized in those groups. For example, why Mohanty's work, and thus her attention to Toni Morrison's narrative in Beloved, suggests that by sharing and recognizing a common authorship, a common experience shared by individuals, in this case Morrison's protagonists, Seth and Paul D., a collective or partial identity can be uncovered and explored. She does not address whether such a realist theory of identity can transcend a homogeneous difference circle, a circle constructed primarily of African American experiences, in Morrison's narrative, a slave experience, to intersections and connections with persons not living on the margins and not sharing those raw materials, contribute to a creation of identity, African American experiences. Charles Taylor, in The Politics of Recognition in 1992, hints that this connection or recognition between the dominant social or cultural identity and those who sit in the margins may be possible, arguing specifically for a recognition of social and cultural differences, a recognition by public institutions. Taylor asserts that human identity is created dialogically in response to our relationships with others. Thus, Taylor claims that public recognition is essential in order to allow for a location which we can deliberately open and publicly about those fundamental parts of our identity that we share or potentially share with one another. He suggests that there may be parts of our identity we do not share, and those parts need to be uncovered. In Taylor's now famous essay, he presents a host of important questions regarding the recognition of difference. Specifically, he contemplates whether democratic society can treat all of its members, citizens, fairly and justly as equals. Should a government try to ensure the survival of specific cultural groups? Is political recognition of ethnicity or gender essential to a person's dignity? Taylor advocates for a procedural government that nurtures a particular culture while giving recognition to and thus protecting the protection of basic rights and welfare of those who sit on the margins of society. Should a government try to ensure the survival of specific cultural groups? Is political recognition of ethnicity or gender essential to a person's dignity? Taylor advocates for a procedural government that nurtures a particular culture while giving recognition to and thus protecting the basic rights and welfare of those who sit on the margins of society. Taylor writes, sorry, I had to read that part twice. Due recognition is not just a courtesy we owe people, it is a vital human need. In asserting this, Taylor and other communitarians, Benjamin Barber, Alastair McIntyre, and Michael Sandel and Michael Walzer, appear to push a step further than Mohanty's work with the optimistic assessment that the possibility of finding or creating such a location where we connect upon some commonalities of identity with the dominant culture and thus find a place to do a cooperative politics. Taylor argues that the society that is able to recognize individual identities and the commonalities or potential for commonalities will be deliberative democratic society because individual identity is partly constructed by collective dialogues. 1992, page B7. Barber, for example, in Strong Democracy in 1984, would agree and suggest that it is creative consciousness, a concept that arises out of what she calls common talk, common decision, and common work, and is premised on an active and perennial participation that aids in this endeavor. This is a powerful assertion that suggests that our identities are shaped not only by the recognition but also the misrecognition of others. In other words, non-recognition or misrecognition can inflict direct harm, misgendering, on those persons who do not seem to be who they are or who we characterized as something they are not. Taylor would concur as he recognizes how non-recognition and misrecognition can cause harm, can be oppressive, as it imprisons individuals in a false or distorted and reduced mode of being. 1992, page 2B25. He continues, the thesis is that our identity is partly shaped by recognition or its absence, often by the misrecognition of others, and so a person or group of people can suffer real damage, real distortion, if the people or society around them mirror back to them, confining a demeaning or contemptible picture of themselves. Taylor, 1992, page B25. Here, McIntyre's suggestion that the narrative concept of selfhood is twofold contributes to our discussion. I am what I may justifiably be taken by others to be in the course of living out our story that runs from my birth to my death, and I am the subject of that history that is my own work and no one else's, that has its own particular meaning. McIntyre, 1984, page 217. I accept Taylor's argument, but its is important to expand upon and thus contemplate his and others' assertions regarding recognition in ways that we engage in public dialogue. James Baldwin, in The Fire Next Time in 1963, writing before Mohanty, Taylor, and McIntyre, also addresses the notion of identity and specifically the powerful effects of mixed recognition or being a part of a story that marginalizes particular individual and groups' experiences. His work focuses on the understanding of and the movement towards a social or cultural identity across color lines to incorporate a deeper knowledge of both black and white experiences and thus identity constructs. Baldwin's narrative is designed to present two letters. I'm going to read what it says on the page. I don't use these words in common speech every day. So, white and black experience, and thus identity constructs. Baldwin's narrative is designed and presented as two letters, one to his nephew on the 100th anniversary of emancipation, and the other entitled Dawn at the Cross, Letter from a Region in My Mind, 1963. In the first letter, Baldwin cautions his nephew that he should never rely on his experience and never consider himself to be what white people have called a nigger. Thus, that is, Baldwin suggests an avoidance and an active struggle against ways a dominant society, the white society, sees the other. I agree with that. I agree with this man. Don't. Yeah. Foreshadowing Taylor's notion of misrecognition, trust whence you came, is the suggestion made by Baldwin in a movement to demonstrate the need for remembering who you are as a person of color, thus incorporating Mohanty's attention to buried memories and experiences. So just because someone calls you the N doesn't mean that you should be that or identify yourself as that. So that's different than what they were saying above. They say when the shared experiences are all those experiences. This one's saying that you should not. You have to have an individual definition of yourself, regardless of what the mainstream is. And unfortunately, the mainstream historically was pretty fast and loose with the N-word, which I cannot abide by. But the contribution to political theory and cultural studies comes from Baldwin's telling of how he knows the experience of Harlem, whereas the white man does not, but should, regardless of whether that experience of knowing Harlem is good or bad for white America's psyche. Baldwin argues that in order for our politics to be just, there needs to be recognition of the part of white America of this shared experience. Specifically, a recognition of black identity and the fact that people of color are co-authors of American. Agreed. United States story. Baldwin eloquently states that black people already have a sense of this experience of co-authorship since it has been their struggle for identity in conjunction with white America's pursuit of a cultural dominance. I'd argue against that because a lot of things stem from black culture and have become mainstream. And that's what makes America great, is this ability for the melting pot, which they call the American myth, to streamline the best parts of other cultures into the main. Now, this main culture is misidentified as white culture because whites are the majority, but it's not. Like rock and roll, jazz, rap music. These are things I enjoy, but stem from a culture that's different than mine, can only be a product of cultures that are different than my own. I read on. Sorry, just interjecting there. I like to interject when I'm reading this. I can't keep my thoughts in my head. Where'd I leave off? Okay, so understanding that Harlem is good or bad. Baldwin argues that in order for our politics to be just, there needs to be recognition of part of white America. Baldwin eloquently states that black people already have a sense of experience and co-authorship since it has been their struggle for identity. Baldwin is convinced America as a whole will not survive if whites do not make the same efforts at coming to terms with their collective stories and shared experiences that have been co-authored by blacks, as well as homosexuals and non-male America. So female, non-male. Remember, everything has to be the politically correct. You can't say women. You need to say non-male. Why not to say women? Non-male, America. Baldwin writes, whatever white people do not know about the Negroes reveals precisely and inexorably what they do not know about themselves. Agree. When it comes to this, that if we persist in thinking ourselves as one, we condemn ourselves with the truly white nations to sterility and decay, whereas if we accept ourselves as we are, we might bring a new life to Western achievements and transform them. 1963, page 108. I like that guy's writing. I like what he was saying about don't consider yourself the N-word, even though the mainstream's calling you that. Your self-identity is more important than the collective identity of yourself. I like that. It's different than what the author's saying, but I guess it should be all taken into consideration. Excuse me. Baldwin is warning against both non- and misrecognition while at the same time calling for a collective understanding of our co-authored stories across the lines, black and white, so that just democracy might be obtained. Bell Hooks in Black Looks and Race and Representation, 1992. Writes, also speaks of misrecognition in a series of critical essays on representation. She writes, the critical essays gathered in Black Looks are gestures of defiance. They represent my political struggle to push against the boundaries of the image, to find words that express what I see, especially when I am looking in ways that move against the grain. There's nothing more American than defiance. When I am seeing things that most folk want to believe simply are not true, and when Hooks addresses difference and the possibilities of connecting one kind of human experience with another, she warns us about being obstacles to this endeavor. That we wanted to find shared ground. Obstacles clearly represented in her mind by the commodification of difference and the consumer cannibalism of what can result from cultural tourism. Okay, you're going to talk about commodification. Yeah. In Spike Lee's film, Do the Right Thing, USA 1989, we are presented with a clear example of commodification of black culture when an audience encounters Pina, John Turturro, an Italian-American, who, hey, Italians aren't white. They can say that N-word, right? An Italian-American in the movie, who when asked who his favorite athlete is, responds, Magic Johnson. His favorite comedian, Eddie Murphy. His favorite rock star, Prince. Trying to explain these loyalties in one who hates blacks, Pino stumbles for reason. It's different. Magic, Eddie, Prince are not niggers. I mean, they're not black. I mean, they're black, but they're really not. They're really black. They're more than black. He stumbles around. It's different. Lindworth, 1996, page 29. So the commodification of black people sees them as not people, but as objects. And I would argue that the worst way of this, specifically because I've had to suffer through this, reading this to you, is the N-word. When you hear the N-word in raps and music and media, in pop media, it's commodifying, like in Nicki Minaj's song, Beat It Up, Catch a Charge, extra large and extra hard, when she's talking about WAP. Like, that's giving the idea of what a black man should be. He needs to be hard, he needs to be strong, he should have a charge. You're not a man unless you have a felony against you. It's commodifying black men as a tool in her song, in that example I just gave you. And in this one, it's an Italian American, which again, Italians are not white. It's an Italian American commodifying his favorite black athletes, rock stars, and comedians, even though he's a racist and doesn't see them as equals or humans. He sees them as objects, as a player, as a comedian, as a media. Sorry, that's my Nicki Minaj take on the N-word, and also the commodification of black people, or commodification of any people. Lees aims to imply that not only an absence of recognition, but a misrecognition of somewhat perpetuated by the commodification of black culture in that it denies the essence of difference. Drawing on Hooks, we must recognize the oppositional space that has been created where sexuality, race, and gender are named and represented without being absorbed into the dominant social or cultural identity. Maybe oppositional space can act as a starting point in the search for a creative, transformative process, a place where we might begin to understand and or envision how to do politics in a way that both respects and transcends different lines, that is, a place from which black life and other than what is identified as dominant can be recorded outside the filters have been constructed that's worded weird, can be recorded outside and away from filters that have been constructed by a dominant cultural hegemony. In Beloved, Toni Morrison wrote, definitions belong to the definers, not the defined. 1988, page 162. Hence, Hooke's oppositional space, what she at times calls her home place, serves as a place of recovery and resistance to a dominant and harmful representation of difference, but also points to different areas that might be shared in common. So this home place that they're talking about is that retreat back into your racial group, that retreat back into your sexual orientation group, where you can't be a part of the mainstream. You need a safe place, safe home place. They calls it the home place, but it's really like what people identify as safe place, where you can go and work on your ideas, be who you are. Serves as a place of recovery and resistance to a dominant, harmful representation. So kind of like finding an eddy in the side of a river where you can go swim when you're tired, so that you're not carried downstream by the main media, by the mainstream. I read on. Resistance to this oppositional space is powerful. Following the era of new social movements in the 1960s, and specifically the avoidance of politicizing themes in ways that we are within the binary code of the universe of social action, the attack on liberal theory's assumption that all action can be boxed quite neatly in either private or public corridors, and has been under counterattack for some time from conservative communitarians. New social movements effectively challenge and continue to challenge the dual understanding of politics, public versus private issues and concerns. Essentially, new movements have been deconstructed our theoretical understanding of what it is to be considered appropriate public debate. New social theorists have suggested that the social movements of the 1960s and beyond, gay rights, civil rights, women's rights, non-male rights. Why did they say women here but not women on the other page? Why does it have to be women's rights when it should be non-male rights? Use women in one place, use non-male in the other, because you need to redefine definitions. Movements directed at the personal and focused on individual identity and body politics represent a paradigm of new politics. This struggle for a new understanding suggests a move away from money, property, political position, and other material resources towards knowledge and values that are informed by our sexual orientations, racial classifications, and gender assignments or constructions. McCrea and Markle, 1989. In essence, through these movements, people were and are claimed collectively their right to realize their own identities grounded in non-traditional and non-dominant experiences, and thus challenging the conventional separation between private and political spheres. Melucci, 1980, and Croteau, 1995. This work at times is dependent upon coalitional politics, a shared politics across difference lines, and a politics that is not easy, but one that still should be celebrated. Those that oppose new politics, conservatives like Arthur Schlesinger in The Disuniting of America, 1992, William Bennett, The Devaluing of America, 1992, and Alan Bloom, The Closing of the American Mind, in 1987, Lynn Cheney in Telling the Truth in 1995, all those people, again, she's just going to gloss over all these conservative ideas, have suggested that the deconstruction of experience and truth coming out of the new social movements and the advances made by those activists and academics with regard to Black, ethnic, gay, and gender studies programs have helped to unravel the moral framework of the United States by disregarding and dismissing a genuine understanding of the culture's true moral values. In her book, Cheney, not Dick Cheney, Lynn Cheney, writes, I want to show how we have come to live in a world where offenses are constantly being redefined. I want to consider distortions and diversions being wrought by a kind of thinking that denies there where is truth, and examining how it is to be postmodern approach has become entrenched and powerful. Cheney, 1995, page 21. For Schlesinger, Bennett, and Bloom and Cheney, and many of their like-minded colleagues, difference is not acceptable and should not be recognized when it challenges the canonical thinking of what is acceptable identity and knowledge are. Differences becomes a distortion, a diversion, and a powerful assertion of liberal assimilation. These assertions are often understood by some cultural theorists and scholars of color in terms of violence and coercion. That's my dog snoring. So, similar attempts to offer reasons to reject the place of personal and individual identity and difference in a political sphere are present in the work of John Rawls, Political Liberalism, 1971, 1993, A Theory of Justice, 1971. Specifically, his work privileges individual rights and sets democratic procedures for protecting those rights, what is characterized by a system of fair social cooperation between free and equal persons over individual identity and any proclaimed notion of difference, Rawls, 1993. The difference with this is that identity and selfhood are made subordinate to democratic procedures. So your identity is below what is expected to you in a democracy. It doesn't matter what you identify as, you have to do your civic duty, is this what they call liberal Rawls. And procedures are known at times force assimilation. The difficulty with this is that identity and selfhood are made subordinate to democratic procedures, in addition to being discredited when contrasted by the dominant view of citizenship. You can't be a black American, you need to be an American. You can't be Marx actually wrote about this in Die Judenfrage, about having any title before the title of citizen in a democracy. He was adamantly against these segregation of self-identity, which is interesting. In other words, the privilege to procedure over dissenting voices when discussing the possibilities for a just democracy can be harmful to those persons within the various differences circles, geometrically segregated groups, as well as the oppressive to any creative or imaginative efforts at transcending difference in the very reason identified by Taylor, lack of recognition. Muff explains that liberals' procedural objective, is to provide a moral, albeit minimal, consensus on political fundamentals. Their political liberalism aims at defining a core morality that specifies the terms under which people with different conceptions of the good can live together in political association. 1996, page 249. These terms are supposedly neutral with respect to controversial images of sexuality, race, and gender, thus providing political principles in which assumption can be acceptable to all persons despite their individual differences. 1996, page 249. However, this is clearly not representative of the United States today, and Phillips' Democracy and Difference, which is this book, 1993, rightfully suggests that we can abandon any desire for undifferentiated unity as a foundation of our democratic politics. She suggests instead that we turn our attention to what she calls complex unity. I think undifferentiated unity means the core, the whole, what each person in a society, in a democracy, has feelings towards the government or whatever. And complex unity comprised of difference and potentially conflicting solidarity. So complex unity sounds like it's whatever this group, the geometrically isolated groups, think it is. And this one thinks it differently. This one thinks differently. There's a lot of fraying of forces pushing against a unity there. We could have many unities, just different. Separate but equal, they might say. Potentially conflicting. So we should not remain harnessed to the notion that equality is only possible when our differences are finally erased. Yeah, equality is only possible when our differences are erased. Whether those differences are in skill or whether those differences are in race. You want equality, you're going to have to get rid of all those. It's only possible when our differences are finally erased and consensus recognized. 1993, page 8. This complex unity is fragile and suggests an incompleteness that may persist inevitably. Bonnie Honig, Difference, Dilemmas, and the Politics of Home in 1996 explains that to take difference and not just identity seriously in democratic theory is to affirm the inescapable of conflict and the ineradicability of resistance to the political and moral projects of ordering subjects, institutions, and values. 1996, page 258. Moff, in The Return of the Political, 1993, also contributes by uncovering what she calls an illusion of consensus and the call for anti-politics as being fatal to democracy. Specifically, Moff calls for a pluralism that shines positively on difference and rejects what she calls the objectivity of unanimity and homogeneity. 1996, page 246. However, while these critiques shift our attention by suggesting an absence of liberal utopia, a place where those living on the margins of society feel they are full members and partners in a democratic endeavor with those not living on margins, they do not release us from attempting to locate, create, and imagine some capacity for connecting one kind of human experience with another. That is, finding a place where we both can recognize and accept that community does not come ready-made, nor is it reached through procedural democracy that underscores terms for suffrage, representation, a political equality. Rather, Phillips and Moff call for a radical politics of democratic engagements where both community and solidarity are constructed through the active involvement of people trying to sort out their differences themselves. Phillips, 1993, page 20. And the recognition of what there will never be a rational political consensus. Moff describes any attempt at universal rational political consensus as a horizon that can never be reached. 1996, page 254. A theorist like Charles Taylor, on the other hand, suggests that through a public exchange, one can discover him or herself, or itself. That's my dog. Exchange can discover him or herself and recognize his or her co-membership in a democratic society. Thus, we may be able to arrive at a consensus of some sort. We learn of commonalities and differences of who we are and who we want to be through a public exchange based on free discussion among equal citizens. However, how does one conceptualize the notion of a public exchange within the public sphere? What language does one use? Whose meanings are we relied upon? Keep on changing meanings, it's going to be anyone's meaning. And it is possible to avoid a communitarian common good by oppressive in nature. This conceptualization is essential if we are to better understand what Saleh Ben Habib refers to as the present democratic moment and the possibilities I have outlined for this work. Ben Habib, 1995, page 5. Specifically, I will suggest that film be considered a form of democratic communication that will help to illuminate the commonalities and differences in our society and thus serve as a complementary approach to Taylor's. However, in a complementary approach, we should not expect consensus to arrive on any anti-politics that erases our differences and establishes a neutral political arena. So we can't get rid of our differences once we agree. We need to keep our differences. Fine.